Hello, everybody. Almost 9 months ago, actually, almost exactly 9 months ago, the New York Times writer, columnist, podcaster, Ezra Klein, who has a huge following now, wrote a piece. It was on April the 17th earlier this year, suggesting that the emergency is here. I'm quoting him. He said, the emergency is here. The crisis is here. It's not 6 months away. It's not another Supreme Court ruling away from happening. It's happening now. So that got me thinking about the emergency. I wondered what it meant. Of course, I fed it into the internet, which knows everything. And one response was call 911. Not sure how effective that would be these days. They probably wouldn't even pick up. And another response was to lead me to a new book by my guest today, George Packer, very distinguished nonfiction writer, who has a novel out. It's called The Emergency, and according to its publisher, it illuminates the crises of our times. George is joining us from Brooklyn in New York. George, congratulations on the new book, The Emergency. So I have to ask you, given that Ezra Klein beat you to it, are we in an emergency? Although you probably already came up with the title of the book before he wrote that piece. Maybe he had a sneak preview of the novel.
Well, I didn't get it to him in time for that, but I did start writing it, I think in late 22 or early 23, and I already had the title right off the bat. So I think that I don't want to claim to have won that competition, but I was there a little early. Are we in an emergency? Yeah, absolutely. We're not quite in the emergency of the title of my novel, which we can get to, but as Americans in 2025, we are sliding into authoritarianism, into massive corruption on a daily basis, on a scale we've never seen. And the big emergency is it's hard to tell what the public thinks about all this. And I've been quite pessimistic about that, and maybe lately gotten a little more hopeful that the public is waking up and doesn't want to lose the things that I think make us a great country. So we'll see where it goes, but we are in an emergency for sure.
Last time you were on the show, too long ago, 3 or 4 years ago, you had a new book out at the time. It was called Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal. Has America slipped further into crisis, George, since we last talked 3 or 4 years ago?
Absolutely. With amazing speed, Andrew. I mean, I would say in the last 10 or 11 months, Donald Trump has broken more rules, norms, laws, and just moral taboos than, say, Viktor Orban managed to do in 10 years, or maybe about as many. But that's an incredibly fast. I know things happen fast in America, but that's really rapid descent into a situation where, the way I see it, the checks on his power have been falling away one after another, largely because of the passivity or the just willingness of people with power to let it go, to abandon their own ability to stop him because of greed or fear or political advantage or lots of different motives depending on where they sit. But what it means is Congress, the Supreme Court, the independent agencies of the government, the press, and in some ways the public, and big corporations, universities, law firms, they've all acquiesced way more than I thought they would, and way more quickly. And I think when Trump pushes at something and it just kind of melts away, he keeps going. He doesn't stop. And that's what's happened.
Klein did another show a few weeks ago, actually a couple of weeks ago, in which he revisited his own idea of this emergency. And he said he felt faintly more optimistic now. Back in April, it didn't seem as if anyone was resisting Trump. The universities, the Supreme Court, law firms, individuals. But things seems to have changed, George, haven't they? I mean, you wrote hopefully about the day of no kings. Universities are pushing back. It doesn't seem inevitable that the Supreme Court now is altogether in the Trump camp. More and more legal decisions questioning this new imperial presidency. So aren't things slightly more hopeful?
Well, I would take each of those and examine it. The election of last month was a sign that the public really is disenchanted. Now, we don't know if that's because of the cost of living, the erosion of democracy, the treatment of immigrants in brutal deportations, or what, but the public is obviously not happy with the Republican Party. They got wiped out. Law firms and universities, some are pushing back, but a lot are not. A lot have already acquiesced. The Supreme Court, I disagree with you. I think everything in the last couple of weeks suggests that the Supreme Court is going to hand Trump all the power he wants, whether it's with firing the heads of independent agencies or imposing mid-decade gerrymandering in a way that is clearly based on pure political and maybe racial grounds. No, the Supreme Court is in his pocket, I fear. And if I were Justice Kagan, Sotomayor, or Jackson Brown, I would be feeling rather grim about my tenure there, because they're going to be in the minority for a long time. So anyway, the big question will be next year's midterms, not just which way they go, but whether they will go as they should. I'm not completely confident that we will have free and fair elections. We will have elections, but they might be confused. There might be deliberate muddying of it all. There might be local and state officials who betray their job, their oath. And there might be Trump just creating mayhem. So,
well, he'll certainly be trying to create mayhem.
Yeah.
George, earlier you said you're not sure what the American people think, but the polls are suggesting that they're not entirely in his camp. His low 40s now has slipped to mid 30s approval rate. So we do know that there's obviously a hardcore MAGA right. There's a hardcore progressive anti-MAGA left. But the people stuck in between are more and more uneasy, particularly on the economic front, aren't they?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the Democrats are in disarray. They don't have a coherent vision, but they're the beneficiaries of Trump just really overplaying his hand in issue after issue, whether it's the tax bill that he passed that was so favorable to the rich and corporations and so punitive on the poor, on people on food stamps and Medicaid, or his treatment of immigrants, which has been just so glaringly cruel, almost like a demonstration of cruelty, and his apparent inattentiveness to the cost of living, which was his big issue last year. He just doesn't seem, when you've replaced everyone who's doing their job on the basis of facts and substitute people who are doing it on the basis of ideology and loyalty, the president is going to be the last person to know what's happening and what's real. And I think that's true of Trump. Presidents are always in a bubble. He's in some sort of, low density, I don't know what you call it.
There's too much talk of bubbles these days in Silicon Valley. He's in a bubble of a bubble.
Yeah.
George, I've always, and you've been watching American politics for a long time now. There seems to be, it's obvious that there's a performative quality to Trump's cruelty that gives him not just pleasure in expressing cruel thoughts and cruel actions and supporting cruel actions, but clearly from a political point of view, he believes at least that it benefits him. I sometimes wonder whether the cruelty of the regime is more performative than practical. I'm not in any way defending anything they do, but is there a quality to that? You've written this fictional book the emergency, which I know you're a big fan of Orwell. There's an Orwellian element, but isn't there a Latin American quality, magical realist quality, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, to Trump in his performative cruelty?
Right. The what is it called? One of his titles, the president in his palace, or the
something like that.
Dictator in his palace.
And they're always dictators, and they're always in their palaces, just
like
Trump.
And maybe it's in his East Room ballroom palace. I think so. I think Trump lives in an other reality of his own devising, which has been incredibly successful in imposing it on a large part of the American public. But I do think there still is a world, you mentioned Orwell, a world in which 2 + 2 must equal 4, in which the price of gas and eggs and housing will end up mattering, in which people can't be convinced that up is down forever. And Trump has been so good at doing that I think he won't know when it stops working. And it may be that it's stopping working right now. And that the solid ground of reality, as unpleasant as it can be, is just pushing people's minds away from the deal he's made. But about cruelty, I write a lot about refugees, especially Afghan refugees, and I pay attention to what people like J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller say. And what they say is, we do not want those people here because they cannot be made into Americans. Americans are basically, and sometimes they put it quite as directly as this, white Christians who have many, many generations of family here. With Vance, how American you are depends on how many dead bodies are buried in your family cemetery. With Miller, it's quite blatantly about race and religion.
I think with Miller, the cruelty isn't performative. Of all of them, he seems the least performative. He seems to be genuinely evil.
Yeah, I mean, we're not supposed to make these comparisons, but he's the one guy who, when I hear him speak, as he did at the Charlie Kirk service, I just hear it in German. It's just immediately.
Yeah, there is he does have something of the Goebbels about him, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does.
I think he even tries, and he gets pleasure. He probably dresses up in a Nazi uniform in his bedroom at night.
Yeah, well, I don't know if he does that, but you can be sure that if he had been German in 1933 or 38, that this is what he would have been doing. He would have been entirely comfortable with it.
And the fact that he's Jewish, of course, adds to the paradox. You wrote a good piece in The Atlantic on this, condemning millions for one man's crime. There was, of course, a very tragic assassination attempt of a couple of National Guards a couple of weeks ago in D.C., and Trump and Miller and the others, probably Vance, blamed all Afghans, didn't they, George?
They did, and I know some of the Afghans they're blaming, and these are refugees who are stranded in Pakistan, having fought alongside Americans during the war, and were about to be resettled here through the refugee program, which is the most vetted program in the world as far as security goes. And when Trump came back in, he halted the program, and now he's not just closing it down, but is going to re-examine all the people who have come here and look into their asylum claims and their green card interviews and find reasons to get rid of them. Because it turns out that, as Stephen Miller said in a social media post a few days ago, failed states, when you bring in these numbers of people, failed states don't stop at their borders. They come in too. We're bringing in entire societies. In other words, it's called collective punishment and guilt by birth and blood. And these are entirely, I'll be blunt and use a word I've been avoiding for years, fascistic. That is the thinking of fascism. And it's the opposite of liberal democracy. So basically,
yeah, I agree. I'm not a big fan of the word fascism, and one can accuse these people of taking fascist tactics without necessarily being fascist.
Yeah,
There's a
they're
difference.
actually not as serious as fascists, because fascists mobilized entire societies to work themselves to the bone and to sacrifice and eventually to go to war. And I think one of Trump's sort of advantages is he asks nothing of people except to tolerate cruelty toward people who are not them. And that's
George, I want to come to the novel because that's why we're here. But the one institution we didn't mention earlier in terms of pushing back against Trump is the military. There have been a number of interesting podcast shows recently on the loyalty towards Trump within the military. Of course, General Milley resisted him very effectively in the last, in Trump 1. What's your sense of the loyalty or horror within the military towards Trump and MAGA?
Well, first, I should say I'm not doing the reporting on that would give me a really good, solid view. And it's hard to do the reporting because Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, or War, as he would like to say, kicked out all the serious journalists from the Pentagon and replaced them with toadies and stooges. So it's hard, not impossible, to know. But a lot of unnamed, anonymous civilian and military defense people say that it's demoralizing because they know they're being given illegal orders. They know that good people are being fired for terrible reasons. And they know that Trump is politicizing the armed forces, giving speeches to troops that are nakedly partisan, which is something that no president thinks that they should do, and almost all presidents refrain from doing. For Trump, it's just natural. You have an audience, they're in uniform, they're your soldiers, you think of them as your personal army, you're going to give a political speech. And so there's an erosion of the independence and nonpartisanship of the military. It is under civilian control, but there are limits, there are rules, there's actually international law, and there's a code of military justice, and none of that seems to matter to Trump and Hegseth, which means the people just below them, the generals, are going to have to ask themselves over and over again, should I carry out this order or this policy when I know it's illegal and wrong? And so far they're doing it. They're doing it with these targeting of boats in the Caribbean, including of civilians who are clearly defenseless and trying to survive, and they're being
Mark Kelly was involved in a controversy on this. George, one of the headlines for the new book, it was an Australian headline, was about when facts fail. Is that why you chose to write a novel rather than another work of nonfiction? You always seem to be a step ahead of everybody else. Your 2013 book, I thought, was particularly good, The Unwinding, an inner history of the new America, which really focused in a laser way on the inequalities and the appearance of more than one America. Then your 2021 book, Last Best Hope, was about the fragmentation of America into 4 different places. Were you, in a sense, forced to write this novel, having already covered most of the ground from The Unwinding to Last Best Hope? Was it a kind of logical, inevitable step to go to fiction?
I did feel I had, in 2021, I felt by that time I had said what I had to say, and I didn't know what I could say that would be really new. Of course, there would be news, but I don't just want to react to the day's headlines. Anything really large, I'd said it, or someone had said it, and it was the same thing over and over. It was becoming repetitive. And that's bad for a writer. You feel yourself beginning to sort of wither away if you don't have new ideas, new language, new emotions that you want to convey through a book. And look, I love fiction. I wrote 2 much unheralded novels in my 30s, way back in the 1990s. I read fiction all the time. I wanted to be a novelist for a long time until those two books convinced me that really I should probably be a journalist. And by 2022, I felt like if I'm going to keep writing, I'm going to write fiction right now, because that will give me a chance to refresh myself, to sort of enter into my imagination and see what's there. I'm not fleeing the subject of America today, but in The Emergency, what I've done is created essentially a political fable. It is political, but it's a fable. You don't know when and where it takes place. There's no digital technology. There's none of the signposts of our world. There's none of the names, none of the places. There's no Trump or Trump-like figure. So I was influenced by Orwell, of course, 1984, by Camus, The Plague, by Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, by J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians. All of these wonderful works of fiction that essentially are trying to bring you closer to reality by pulling you away from it, by making it strange. And the weirder, the better. The weirder, the clearer your vision gets, because you're not distracted by all the familiar words and stories and people. You don't think you already know it because you've seen it before. Instead, it's new and shocking even. And there's a lot of room for invention. And what I've had to do is build an entire world from scratch. And I have to say, it was an exhilarating experience. So why wouldn't I want to do it at least this one time, and get myself back into journalism through the imagination?
Do you see it as an indulgence?
Not at all. I think fiction is a serious discipline. It's hard, man. It is
No,
hard.
I'm not suggesting that fiction is an indulgence. I'm suggesting your shift into fiction.
You know, I think it was this, or kind of go a little silent and just begin to repeat cliches. And I don't think that would be good for me or my readers. So no, I think this was it was an indulgence of my literary pleasures, my, maybe illicit literary pleasures. So yes, in that sense, I was kind of taking off my journalist uniform, but it was also something that I thought would actually get me farther in understanding where we are today as Americans, losing what's valuable about this country by creating a place and a time that don't exist, than I would by just drilling into the same boards over and over again that, tell us what we already know.
So what does The Emergency tell a reader who has already read The Unwinding and Last Best Hope, and as you say, many, many other books covering the same ground? What were you trying to tell the reader or the world about America, or maybe the world in the mid-20s, the second quarter of the 21st century, that they wouldn't get in a nonfiction work?
Well, first, I'm trying to convey what it feels like today, not what is happening in the outside world, but what it feels like to watch a world you thought would always be there, because it had always been there, disappear before your eyes with a speed that you can't begin to fathom. What it feels like to be a parent in that world and see your children responding to that collapse by, in a sense, turning into their own way, rejecting some of the values that you thought were permanent values, and instead looking for new ones, and overthrowing the status quo of their parents. And all of that is part of the story in The Emergency. It's a family novel. It's about a doctor and his wife and their children in a city at the moment when an empire that they've always lived in and has always been there collapses. I say that it died of boredom. And in the vacuum, this emergency happens, which is essentially, how do we govern ourselves? What kind of life should we live? And the children have a very different idea from the doctor, the father. And it's his relationship with his daughter that is sort of the emotional core of the novel. His attempts to hold on to her without simply giving in and telling her that you're right. Everything I've always taught you and believed it was wrong. So that's a a kind of dilemma, an emotional dilemma for this man who's middle-aged and successful and rather complacent, but doesn't want to lose his daughter. And what happens, that will answer the question maybe a little more directly, what am I trying to say, is a kind of war breaks out between the city people, who are called burghers, and the rural people, who are called yeomen. And why does it happen? Not because there's some triggering incident or legitimate grievance, but because they each begin to suspect the other of trying to destroy them. And a kind of paranoia sets in the city and in the countryside. And the doctor and his daughter go out into the countryside on a kind of quixotic mission and find out just how much has changed in the countryside as well as the city. And it's turned against them. Like, there are roadblocks, there's checkpoints along the way on roads that they used to travel as a family with no problem. And that kind of ominous menace sets in and begins to change the way the doctor sees things. He can no longer assume that if we just all sit down and talk to each other across these divisions of generation and of class, we will understand each other and be able to get along, but through compromise. That's no longer possible. And I think that's the direction we are going in. And the ultimate endpoint of it, I hope we don't get there, is violence, is large-scale violence. And that's the sort of the threat hanging over the whole story.
You mentioned that you were very influenced by Orwell. I think you've edited a couple of his writings. Orwell, of course, is a controversial figure. Like all great writers, we had and not Margaret Atwood. I had Margaret Atwood on the show another time. I had the author of Wifedom, Anna Funder, on the show a couple of years ago. And of course, Orwell's relationship with his wife is controversial. I wonder, George, in the way you've presented this, I'm not suggesting in Orwellian terms, but whether there's a kind of Burkean conservatism about the project, that, or at least about your main character, of a world disappearing and an unease about that, and that by definition, and perhaps many of our generation, our class, our intellectual leanings, we've all become rather too conservative in trying to keep a world that's disappearing because we don't know anything better.
That's a very good thought, and it's true. I find myself becoming more conservative, not politically, and I still believe in high taxes on the rich, etc., but conservative in my sense that there are things that really we should preserve, that each generation can't make the world over again anew, but should look to the past and to the institutions that have survived as sources of wisdom and of stability. Of course, you change them, you reform them, you don't just take them on their own terms year after year, because then that becomes a recipe for collapse. And maybe liberals have done that. So I would say I'm a Burkean liberal more than a Burkean conservative.
Well, Burke himself, of course, was a liberal.
He was a liberal.
He got appropriated by American conservatives, but exactly. I mean, he's a quintessential liberal.
Right. And I, if there's a label I will accept, it's liberal, but I also recognize it's a risky label. It's under attack always from both the right and the left. And it seems today as if it's run out of gas, as if it no longer has answers for the deep dissatisfactions of Western publics, basically, across Europe and North America. And the doctor is a liberal, and he's a liberal who has seen his world sort of begin to break up under his feet. But he's also a father, and his deepest fear is not losing his society, although he does fear that, but losing his daughter. And so this is kind of the tension that drives the entire story as they go out into the countryside and talk and argue and then get separated, and then something terrible happens. The whole time he's trying to tell her, I understand that I've failed you. The empire has collapsed. We're in an emergency. That is a failure of me and my generation. But don't imagine that you can throw all of it out and start over with this flimsy new utopian philosophy called Together, with a capital T, and rebuild the world, because it's not working. We see that all around us. He tells her that the city is in trouble, and then there's this brewing conflict with the rural people. So it's a really difficult thing to navigate as a citizen and a father when the world is, your world is disappearing. The new world is, it worries you, even frightens you, but you know you have to live in it. You know your daughter is not going to live in the same world you lived in, and you want to make sure that you remain her father. The bond between you remains so that you can help her to enter this new world.
Funder's book was called Wifedom. I guess an alternative, the way you're presenting The Emergency, George, another title might have been Parenthood. The way you're describing this historical shift, it brings to mind the 1960s and another generational revolt against parents who didn't understand young people and their discontents.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and it's always easy to argue that history repeats itself. You're too good a historian to know that. But I wonder what's different in the 2020s is that our generation, and I know you've got similarly aged kids to me, our generation seems to have taken parenthood more seriously, certainly, than our parents. And I wonder whether that's why we are taking this current crisis so seriously, so much to heart. Why the hero in your book, I don't know if he's the hero, the main character in The Emergency, if he was around in the 60s, he would have been less bothered with his daughter if she'd have gone off to a commune and had lots of sex and took drugs. But these days, our class, our generation has taken parenthood so seriously that we're really troubled when our kids don't want to have anything to do with us anymore.
Yeah, maybe too seriously. I guess there's something called overparenting.
And I wonder why. I wonder what your analysis of that is and whether that's really true, why we become such serious parents.
Yeah, it seems as if when I was growing up in the 60s, I mean, my parents, my father died when I was very young, but my mother especially took me and my life very seriously. But at the same time, I had a lot more freedom, and a lot more ability to just sort of shape my day and my life. And I don't know, we find some sort of mix of anxiety and narcissism about parenting today. We fear for our children. There's a lot of perceived threats out there, and we also live through them. We live through their achievements. If they get into the right college, it means you've succeeded as a parent. If they don't, you've failed. And that's a terrible curse of our class. But here's one difference I think that's really important in young people today, and this is a big theme in The Emergency. I fear that with devices and with social media and now with AI, there's almost a sense that being human itself is no longer desirable. And slowly, or not so slowly, younger people are sort of, their humanity seems to be dissolving into TikTok videos and into screens and into AI relationships. And we know that they're much lonelier than they used to be. There's a lot of mental health issues. There's a lot of a lack of contact with other people, with their friends, with nature, physical contact. There's a lot less sex, which used to worry our parents. Too much sex. Now
we worry they don't have enough. Yeah.
Too little sex is what worries us.
I always encourage my kids. I don't think they take me very seriously.
I think they'll figure it out on their own, probably. But these are themes of The Emergency. There's as I said, there's no digital technology, but there is a kind of version of non-digital AI, which I call better humans, that are basically kind of mechanical robots that the young people in the city, including the daughter of the doctor, have fashioned after themselves as kind of replacement selves in order to perfect themselves, so that all the sort of the messiness and failure and disappointment of their lives disappears, and instead they live through these better humans. And this, to me, is, a friend of mine said, okay, Orwell's picture of the future in 1984 is a boot stamping on a human face forever. What's your nightmare picture of the future? And I said, well, it's a scene in the novel where the doctor stumbles upon a kind of a workshop in a warehouse district where all these bodies are lying on the floor. And at first he thinks these are dead young people. What's happened? Why have so many young people died? And he gradually realizes that these are not real people. These are the better humans that have been laid out in the workshop as they're being worked on. And
I wonder though, George, I take your point on this, whether this has been said before, most clearly and persuasively by Neil Postman in his 1984 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, when he brilliantly, I thought, at the beginning of the book in a couple of pages said, we got it wrong. It wasn't Orwell we should fear, it was Huxley.
Yeah. I read both of them in high school. Everyone had to when I was in high school. And honestly, even though today I would far sooner be on a desert island with 1984, at the time, Brave New World seemed more real to me because I was growing up in California in the 70s. There was no thought police and Big Brother. There was sex, drugs, and
there was a lot of soma, right?
A lot of soma, and people basically kind of giving up and giving into pleasure. And that's, the nightmare of Brave New World is pleasure takes away your freedom. And that does seem a bit closer, although I think you could also say Big Brother is in your pocket now. Big Brother is that phone that you carry around with you, who's just always surveilling you, always collecting data on you, and in a way controlling your thoughts. So you could say it's a mix of Huxley and Orwell with the technology that we've developed.
Richard Hofstadter, of course, wrote a still very relevant 1964 essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. I wonder, again, coming back to my fear that we are fearing too much change, whether there is a paranoid quality now to progressive thought, whether it's what you fear about technology or the implications of technology and the kind of transhumanism in the emergency, whether it's in the work of people like Jonathan Haidt, that we as a class have become a little paranoid, especially about technology, George.
Yeah, I do worry about that. I mean, look, I know
you worry about the technology, or you worry about our paranoia?
I worry about both, and I worry about finding the right balance. That's the question. I don't just accept that all technological change is good. Look, social media, when it came out in 2010 or so, 2012, I was told you have to be on it. If you're going to have a career in journalism, you have to be on it. I
probably told you that. And when we drove between Amsterdam and Brussels a few years ago.
You might have. Although by then it was wearing out its welcome, because it turned out. So my attitude was, I'm not morally superior to it. I'm inferior to it. I will be addicted to it. I know that. And I will become a bad father and a bad writer if I let this into my life. So I went cold turkey. I never posted on social media throughout those years. And it did hurt me professionally, but it also, I think, kept part of my brain sane, that I was watching go a little crazy in other people, including people I really respected. And now social media is sort of universally denounced as having, destroyed the social fabric and driven us into our camps of extremism. And there's some truth to that. And AI, to me, I look at it and think that's social media times 100. So I don't want to give up the critical view, but I also know AI is inevitable. It's coming, and it'll do some good, and it will be important in my children's lives in a way that it's not in mine. And so, like the doctor in the emergency, I have to make some peace with it. And I don't know how to, because I can't find the right balance between acceptance and and criticism or rejection. And I don't know how freaked out to be. Look, I have a book on my desk here called "If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies."
Yeah, which it's I'm not sure of that type of title. It's the publishing company is invested lots of money in advertising it aggressively on trains and public transportation.
Well, what's the attitude in Silicon Valley where you are, Andrew, toward that book?
Well, I'm not sure everyone would necessarily agree. You said, George, earlier you'd be a bad father, and a bad writer. In that order, what's worse, being a bad father or a bad writer?
Clearly, being a bad father. That's my number one job and the one I love most. But I don't want to give up either. I can't imagine life without my kids, and I cannot imagine life without writing. And that's why when I felt I'd run up against a bit of a wall with journalism, I turned to this novel in order to keep.
Yeah, you gave an interesting interview to the Times saying you've stopped being a prig about beautiful writing, quote unquote. But this kind of book, I mean, the goal, I've been enjoying the book, George, it's not defined by its beautiful writing, and especially Orwell was anything but a beautiful writer. Yes. I had a big argument once with quite a well-known English writer about whether or not Orwell was a good writer. And I think his beauty, so to speak, is in his simplicity, isn't it? Yeah. How do you write for this kind of book? Did you have to control yourself a bit?
No, because when that quote that you're citing was not about my own work, it was about, because I was a real Puritan for years and years when I was younger about prose. I thought if anything shows us a trace of self-display or look at me or a flourish that seems excessive, I just immediately ruled it out, said this is bad. And that meant some perverse decisions like George Gissing, who was not a beautiful prose stylist, but I think was a profound novelist, is a better writer than Virginia Woolf, for example, or Theodore Dreiser is a better writer than F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is just not true almost objectively, but I embraced the plain style influenced by Orwell. I embraced not just simplicity, but also strength, muscularity, a kind of vivid, concrete writing that grabs you and will not let you go, not through flash and dash, but through just the clarity and directness of the prose. And I still write that way. And The Emergency is written very much in that style. It's just that my taste is a little more ecumenical now, and I'm not such a prig as I was when I was young. But most young people are prigs about one thing or another.
Finally, George, in that interview, they asked if you were organizing a literary dinner party, which three writers would you invite? And you, Orwell, surprise, surprise, D.H. Lawrence, more surprising, and Margaret Atwood. I had the honor of having Margaret Atwood on my show talking about The Handmaid's Tale. Why did you choose those three? And what kind of conversation would occur in late 2025 or 26? I mean, D.H. Lawrence famously lived in New Mexico. Margaret Atwood, when I talked to her, she acknowledged that she wrote The Handmaid's Tale with more than one eye on the United States. Yeah. Orwell perhaps was less influenced by the US than either of the other two.
Yeah, that's right. He never came here. And when he did write about it, it was sort of, in the abstract, he approved because we were on the side of Britain and liberal democracy and against fascism. But American culture, American novels, American food, and language, he did not seem to like. But he was a real Englishman. I mean, he was such a conservative, you could say, Burkean Englishman who loved the traditions and the landscape and the culture. So those three, why those three? Well, I love all three. Lawrence would add a lot of surprise and maybe some sharp edges. He was a hugely argumentative man. He had a lot of opinions, many of which we would consider to be unacceptable. Atwood is not at all orthodox or, rigid in her views. She's a real believer in freedom of expression and in kind of an open-mindedness, but she's also obviously, I don't know if she would call herself a feminist, but The Handmaid's Tale is a feminist novel.
Yeah, and I think The Handmaid's Tale is probably the most prescient book of all about MAGA America. I think it's more Orwellian than Orwell himself.
Well, and she had the advantage of writing it in 1984 rather than about 1984. But I think she and Lawrence would probably get into quite a fight, but they would also, I think, recognize each other as fellow literary greats. And Orwell would be maybe less loud and not quite ready to get into the same dust-ups, but would be he would just have some cool observations that to me would make sure the conversation stayed, grounded in kind of like the essentials. Because whenever I read Orwell, I edited, as you said, 2 volumes of his essays. And those essays are where the real Orwell is, even more than 1984, and where you just hear his voice and his clear-eyedness. And that's what I value about him. I never read him without, 1, being interested in what he's saying, and 2, almost always, not always, but almost always thinking that has held up well. That shows a kind of wisdom and common sense, and even more than that, common decency, common moral sense that you want to live by. So
what did you think, by the way, of did you have a chance to read Funder's book, Wifedom?
I haven't. It may be a sign that a writer has really achieved a kind of super greatness when people are writing books about their neglected wife, like Shakespeare, for example.
Yeah, well, there's, of course,
Eileen Orwell was it was a real marriage. They loved each other, but Orwell, had affairs and neglected her for his work. And then when she died very young on the operating table, he was shattered. And that kind of sent him in the wintry direction of his final years, which were not very many. So I don't know what the book is about. Maybe I should read it. But Orwell,
I think you should. I think you'd find it interesting. Finally, sorry, go on.
I don't turn to Orwell for wisdom about women.
Yeah, I think you and Anna Funder would be on the same page there. Finally, should we be thinking now about George Packer as a novelist, as a fictional writer, or will the George Packer of the future, will he return to nonfiction?
I will return to nonfiction, but I don't want to say I'll never write another novel. But mostly, Andrew, it's like you've had this new child. What you most care about, what you think about all the time, is the well-being of this child. So this novel means more to me than anything in my writing life at the moment. I want people to read it. They don't have to love it, but I'd like it to be out there so that people grapple with it. I think it has something to say. I think it has a kind of clarifying effect on us when we're drenched in media. It has an effect of sort of pulling you out of it and getting you to see things maybe in a clearer light. So right now, this novel is what I want to be known for. But I'm basically a nonfiction writer who every now and then turns to the novel. But I'm not. I wouldn't say fully ambidextrous. Well,
the nice thing, George, about books, especially novels, in comparison to children, is they can't tell us where we don't know what we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah, we tell them what to say rather than the other way around.
Well, George Packer, congratulations on the book. Happy New Year. And I hope it won't be 2 or 3 years before we get you back on the show. So much more to talk about. And this Trump, quote unquote, emergency certainly hasn't ended. Be good to get your wisdom. Thank you so much.
I always enjoy talking.